something fundamental just shifted in the global order and most people barely noticed. On January 3, a US military operation in Venezuela sent a message that went far beyond Caracas. It wasn't only about Nicolas Maduro, it wasn't even about Latin America. It was about a much larger idea, quietly reasserting itself on the world stage, that power, not rules, is once again the ultimate currency of international politics. One senior White House official put it bluntly. In the real world, he said, everything is governed by strength, force, power, iron laws, ancient laws. For most of human history, that was true. And the 20th century showed us, in blood and ashes, where that logic leads. Yet here we are again. If you want to understand why this moment matters, not just for Venezuela, but for NATO, for Greenland, for China, for you, stay with me. Because what looks like a single operation may be the opening act of something far larger. And to see it clearly, we need to step back and name the doctrine shaping this new era. To understand what is happening, we have to move past the headlines and ask a harder question: what exactly changed? This is not just about Venezuela, or even about regime change. It is about a shift in how the United States now defines its interests and how it believes those interests should be pursued. For decades after World War II, American power operated inside a framework of rules. Imperfect rules, often bent, sometimes broken, but rules that constrained others as much as they constrained Washington. That framework was not naive idealism. It was a strategic choice born from catastrophe, 2 world wars, the Holocaust, the realization that unchecked power devours itself. What we are seeing now is a deliberate move away from that logic, a belief that restraint is weakness, that legitimacy is optional, that outcomes matter more than process. The question is not whether power matters. It always has. The real question is whether power without rules can remain stable or whether it plants the seeds of its own undoing. To answer that, we need to understand where this system came from and why it is now being abandoned. To see why this shift is so dangerous, we have to return to the moment the modern system was built. For most of history, international politics followed a simple cycle. Power rose, power expanded, power collapsed, empires overreached, wars reset the board, and the process began again. The first half of the 20th century was the most violent expression of that cycle. Tens of millions dead, entire societies shattered, moral limits erased. The post-war order was an attempt to break that pattern. The United States emerged not just as the strongest power, but as the architect of a system designed to restrain raw force, including its own rules, alliances, institutions. Not because America was weak, but because it understood a deeper truth. Power lasts longer when others accept it as legitimate. That system constrained rivals. It also constrained friends. And yes, it constrained Washington. But in doing so, it reduced incentives for unilateral action and raised the cost of aggression. Today, that logic is being reversed. The belief taking hold is that rules slow us down, that institutions dilute sovereignty, that history is written by those willing to act first and apologize later. Once that belief takes root, the system doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes quietly, case by case, precedent by precedent. And that brings us to the first real shockwave. The first real rupture came not with a speech, but with an action. The US raid in Venezuela was framed as decisive, necessary, even overdue. And for many Americans, it felt virtuous. Few mourned the destruction of Iran's Fordo facility in the past. Few protested the rendition of Nicolas Maduro now. Power, after all, feels clean when it is exercised against those we already consider illegitimate. But this is where the danger begins. As Senator J. William Fulbright once warned, power has a way of confusing itself with virtue. It begins to believe that success is proof of moral correctness, that because it can act, it should act, and that because it acted, it must have been right. In the short term, This logic is intoxicating, it projects strength, it silences critics, it creates the illusion of control, but it also sends a message to allies and adversaries alike that rules are conditional and legitimacy is optional. If you're finding this unsettling, you're not alone. This moment isn't just about Venezuela. It's about what happens when force becomes precedent. Because once a doctrine is tested and survives, it looks for its next proving ground. And strangely enough, that test may come not in a war zone, but on an island of ice. At the heart of all this lies a mechanism that is easy to miss, but impossible to ignore once you see it. When a great power abandons rules in favor of raw discretion, it doesn't just change its behavior, it changes the behavior of everyone else. This is what strategists call a permission structure. Actions that were once taboo become thinkable. What was once condemned becomes contextual. Power stops asking for justification and starts offering explanations after the fact. Greenland exposes this mechanism with unusual clarity. On paper, the idea of taking Greenland makes little sense. There is no real economic upside. Mining is brutally difficult. Infrastructure is skeletal. Denmark already subsidizes the island heavily just to maintain a basic standard of living. From a real estate perspective, it is quite simply a money pit. But that's precisely the point. This isn't about profit. It's about precedent. Greenland's strategic location matters. Surveillance, undersea awareness, Arctic corridors opening as ice melts. All of this can be secured through cooperation, something the Danes and Greenlanders are not only willing but eager to provide. There is already a security agreement. There is already consent. So when coercion enters the conversation, it signals something deeper, that consent is no longer required if power is sufficient. And once that logic takes hold, it doesn't stay contained, it looks for the next case. The second crisis doesn't arrive with explosions, it arrives with silence. What is striking about the conversation around Greenland is not outrage, but hesitation. Allies whisper instead of protest. Capitals calculate instead of condemn. Europe watches closely because everyone understands what is really at stake here. Not territory, not minerals, but the integrity of the alliance itself. NATO is built on a simple premise that security is mutual and power is exercised with restraint among partners. Once that assumption cracks, everything becomes negotiable. Trust, commitments, red lines. This is why loose talk about coercing Greenland lands like a shockwave across Europe. If rules can be bent against adversaries, they can be bent against allies. And if they can be bent once, they can be bent again. At the same time, something else is happening almost unnoticed. China, once described as the pacing threat for U.S. national security, barely enters the public conversation. Attention drifts, focus fragments, strategy thins. In geopolitics, distraction is not neutral. It creates openings. While Washington tests the limits of power in familiar theaters, others are studying the implications quietly, patiently, waiting to see whether this new doctrine is a moment or a model. Because if it is a model, they will adapt to it faster than we expect. And this is where the story stops being abstract and becomes personal. Because when doctrines shift, when systems erode, it's not states that absorb the shock first. It's people. It's you. You live in a world where stability has been background noise, where alliances quietly kept markets open, where rules reduce the odds that force would decide your future. When that structure weakens, uncertainty creeps into everyday life. Prices, security, opportunity, trust. Power politics doesn't announce itself at your door. It shows up as volatility, as risk, as a sense that tomorrow is harder to plan than yesterday. And here's the uncomfortable truth. When might becomes the organizing principle, ordinary people rarely benefit. The costs are diffuse, delayed, and deniable, but they are real. Inflation fueled by instability. Investment frozen by fear. Young generations inheriting a world where strength, not law, decides outcomes. If this analysis resonates, pause for a moment, share it, talk about it, because public indifference is what allows doctrines like this to harden without resistance. History doesn't just move because leaders decide. It moves because societies stop paying attention. And that brings us to the global consequences now unfolding beyond any single country. When the rules bend at the center of the system, the shock doesn't travel in a straight line. It ripples outward. Across the world, capitals are recalibrating, not based on what the United States says, but on what it does. If unilateral action is normalized, then spheres of influence regain legitimacy. Russia's claims over Ukraine no longer look like aberrations. China's gray zone pressure in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea starts to feel less exceptional. This behavior isn't new. What's new is the context. In the past, such actions triggered condemnation, isolation, reputational cost. Now the signal is muddier. If power justifies itself, then restraint looks optional, and ambiguity becomes a strategic asset. This is how global order frays not through collapse, but through imitation. Beijing and Moscow are watching closely, not to copy America's tactics, but to study its tolerance for contradiction, how loudly it defends rules, how selectively it applies them, how quickly attention shifts elsewhere. In a world drifting toward a G2 dynamic, where US-China relations shape everything else, this uncertainty is destabilizing, because when the system's anchor drifts, everyone adjusts their course. And once enough actors do that, the old map stops working, which leaves us facing a single, unavoidable question: where does this trajectory lead? If this trajectory continues, the future doesn't collapse into a single outcome. It branches. The first scenario is the optimistic one. Power is exercised, but recalibrated. The United States rediscovers that might and legitimacy are not opposites, that strength anchored in alliances and law multiplies itself. Rules are enforced more selectively, yes, but not abandoned. Greenland becomes a warning, not a precedent. The system bends, but holds. The second scenario is more likely and more troubling. A world of managed unilateralism. Great powers act within informal boundaries, carving out spheres of influence while avoiding direct confrontation. Stability exists, but it is brittle. Smaller states hedge. Alliances weaken. Law becomes language, not constraint. Order survives, but only as long as the strong remain cautious. The third scenario is the darkest. Might fully replaces right. Permission structures harden into doctrine. Others follow the example, not the exception. Power fragments, crises multiply. And the very tools meant to preserve dominance, force, coercion, speed, accelerate decline. History suggests systems don't fall because they are challenged. They fall because they forget why they were built. And that brings us to the final question: what this moment demands of us now. If the world is drifting back toward a might makes right era, then clarity matters more than comfort. Power alone is not self-sustaining. For 80 years, American strength rested on deeper foundations: a resilient economy, openness to talent, unmatched innovation, trusted institutions, and alliances that magnified rather than diluted influence. These were not moral luxuries. They were strategic assets. Maintaining might requires work, modernizing military capabilities, securing supply chains, investing in basic research, strengthening alliances, not just demanding more from them, but proving they still matter, upholding the rule of law that made the United States a magnet for capital and credibility, and confronting the quiet vulnerability few want to discuss: a fiscal trajectory that cannot sustain indefinite power. If these foundations erode, strength will not disappear overnight. It will hollow out, and one day the iron laws invoked so confidently will no longer work in our favor. So the real question is not whether power governs the world. It always has. The question is whether we are wise enough to remember that power endures only when others believe in the system behind it. If this analysis gave you a clearer lens on the moment we're living through, share it, stay engaged, and follow this series because the next chapter of the global order is already being written, whether we're paying attention or not.